You may have heard that Sparta was a military society, but not just in the sense of battles and bronze shields. Sparta didn't just train soldiers, it raised them from the moment they were born. And that journey began with something most other Greek city-states would consider horrifying. Imagine a small stone room on the edge of the village. There is no fire lit. It is quiet. A newborn child, tiny, helpless, eyes barely open, is brought in by a midwife. She doesn't hand the child to the mother. Instead, she walks to the city elders. They are not family, they are not healers. They are not particularly gentle. In Sparta, every baby boy was examined by a group of older men shortly after birth. This wasn't a visit to see if he was healthy for the sake of the family's peace of mind. This was a state-sponsored inspection, a kind of early citizenship evaluation, and the stakes were severe. If the child was considered weak, deformed, or unlikely to grow into a strong warrior, he would be left behind, outside, alone. This practice was called exposure. And while it wasn't unique to Sparta, it was more common than we like to believe in ancient times. Sparta institutionalized it, made it part of the system. The state had a clear objective: strong men for war, and nothing less. Even infants had to meet this requirement. But what did unfit mean to a Spartan elder? We don't know all the criteria. We do know that crying, weakness, any obvious deformities, or even something as small as a perceived hesitation in movement could be enough. The decision wasn't medical, it was ideological. Was this child likely to become a soldier or a burden? If the answer was no, the infant would be taken to a chasm near Mount Taygetus. It was known as the apothetai, literally the place of rejection. Whether all were truly left to die or sometimes secretly rescued by helot families or passers-by, we can't be certain, but the myth and the fear of it were real. Mothers knew, fathers watched in silence. The community accepted. For the babies who passed the inspection, life didn't necessarily get warmer. These were not days filled with lullabies and rocking cradles. Spartan mothers were told not to soothe their crying infants. Too much comfort, they believed, would make a child weak. Babies were expected to be tough from the beginning. Cold baths were encouraged. Swaddling was discouraged. The idea was simple: a future warrior must not be pampered. As the child grew into a toddler, his real upbringing, at least according to Spartan law, remained in the hands of his mother until age 7. But this wasn't the kind of nurturing environment you might imagine. Spartan women were famously different from other Greek women. They were strong, educated, and trained in physical activity. They spoke freely. They ran races. Some even wrestled. Their job, too, was to raise soldiers. A Spartan mother was expected to instill discipline early. A child who threw a tantrum or showed fear was not scolded. He was shamed. Physical punishment was common. Endurance was praised. Boys were told stories of courage and cunning, not kindness. They were trained even in play to admire strength. And then, at age 7, the real shift happened. That's when the state took over. This wasn't a gradual transition. There were no long goodbyes, no easing into a school program. On his 7th birthday, sometimes even earlier, a boy was removed from his family and entered the agoge. This was the Spartan education system, but it was unlike anything we'd associate with education today. The agoge wasn't about reading and writing, though some of that was included. It was about training for war, and training for obedience, and training for pain. The boys were grouped into herds, or agilai, and placed under the authority of an older youth. There were no soft beds, no parents. Meals were sparse, clothing was minimal. Winter was endured without shoes. Discipline was brutal, and importantly, it was encouraged that the boys fight. A boy who didn't stand up for himself was considered not just weak, but shameful. One of the most startling aspects of the agoge was hunger. The boys were underfed on purpose. The goal wasn't starvation, but rather to teach them to steal food, not out of mischief, but out of necessity. And if they were caught, the punishment wasn't for the theft, it was for being caught. That was seen as a failure of cunning. In this way, the Spartan child was taught that strength, resourcefulness, and silence were the ultimate virtues. Whining, complaining, or even showing too much affection could mark a boy as unworthy. There, Were no toys, no lullabies, only practice, only preparation. This might lead you to wonder, how did the boys cope? Did they bond? Did they find moments of joy? They did. But even joy was shaped by discipline. Friendship was encouraged, but it had rules. Obedience to the group mattered more than the individual, and often friendships were overseen or even influenced by older male mentors, sometimes in ways that disturb modern understanding of childhood. What did it mean for a child to grow up without softness, without affection, and with the constant knowledge that weakness was a kind of sin? We'll explore what happened to these boys next, once they entered the full discipline of the agoge. How far did the training go? How much pain was considered acceptable in shaping a Spartan? In the world of ancient Sparta, silence was power, and pain was a test you were expected to pass. By age 7, a Spartan boy was no longer just a child. He was a trainee of the state. The agoge didn't simply educate, it shaped. And what it aimed to shape was a human weapon, one who didn't flinch, didn't question orders, and didn't hesitate in the face of death. Let's take a closer look at what daily life was like inside the agoge. Not the grand tales of Spartan courage sung in poems, but the quieter, colder mechanics of molding a boy into a warrior. Each morning began not with a horn or a parental wake-up call, but with cold air, rough bedding, and the awareness that your every move might be watched. Spartan boys slept together, on makeshift bedding, often reeds gathered from riverbanks cut with bare hands, sometimes without knives as part of their physical training. They wore simple garments, one cloak per year, no shoes, and they were expected to bathe in cold water regardless of the season. Food was meager, mostly a thin barley broth or black soup, melas zomos, made from pig's blood, salt, and vinegar. By most accounts it was unappetizing, but Spartan boys weren't meant to enjoy food, they were meant to tolerate it. Hunger was constant, and that was the point. Hunger, discomfort, exhaustion, all were tools. If a boy complained, he was mocked. If he cried, he was punished. If he failed to show obedience or courage, he was struck, not with gentle discipline, but with hard public correction. Yet, despite the punishments, the worst thing a boy could do was show fear. Fighting among the boys was not just tolerated, it was actively encouraged. Scratches, bruises, even blood. These were seen as signs that a boy was learning to assert himself. They weren't taught to avoid conflict, but to control it. Aggression was a skill, and the agoge trained boys to sharpen it like a blade. Leadership, too, was assigned through dominance. The strongest boys were given small roles of power. The weakest were teased, even beaten. These roles rotated, not to be fair, but to test how each boy responded to command or humiliation. Every moment was a lesson, and every mistake had a consequence. But Spartan education wasn't all physical. Boys did learn to read and write, enough to understand orders and engage in basic communication. They also sang and recited poetry, but not the kind that celebrated love or beauty. They were taught war songs, patriotic verses, and tales of Spartan valor. Music wasn't for relaxation, it was a form of training, and they were expected to be clever. Spartan boys were trained in a dry wit known as laconismos, the art of saying much with few words. This is where the modern word laconic comes from. Being brief, cutting, and clever was considered a sign of intelligence. A Spartan boy who could outsmart his elders with a single line was praised. Here's an example. When a Spartan was told that the arrows of the enemy would be so many that they'd blot out the sun, he calmly replied, "Then we shall fight in the shade." That's laconismos, and Spartan boys were expected to master it. But perhaps the most infamous part of the agoge was the whipping contests. These weren't rare punishments, but scheduled public events. Boys were brought to the altar of Artemis Orthia, and there they were whipped, not for wrongdoing, but as a ritual display of endurance. The objective was to remain silent. Some boys died during these events. That too was part of the message. Pain is irrelevant. Only obedience and courage matter. To modern eyes, this may seem unthinkable, but for Spartans, this was national identity. To raise strong warriors, the logic went, you had to raise strong boys, and that meant stripping away comfort and building discipline through fear and deprivation. Older boys served as mentors, sometimes protectors, sometimes tormentors. These relationships were complex. They were expected to guide, discipline, and bond with the younger trainees. In some cases, historical accounts suggest that these relationships went beyond mentorship, and this has led to scholarly debate about sexuality in the agoge. Regardless of interpretation, the system was built on hierarchy, dominance, and conformity. Interestingly, Spartan boys were also taught a kind of stealth. At night, if they were caught, punishment was harsh, not for the act but for failing to succeed. This culture of secrecy and stealth would culminate in one of the most controversial Spartan institutions, the crypteia. It was an elite group of older boys, often late teens, selected from the best of the agoge. They were sent into the countryside alone with daggers to survive for extended periods and to control the helot population through fear, surveillance, and even assassination. But we'll return to the crypteia later. Back in the agoge, as boys approached their teenage years, their training intensified. They learned how to use real weapons, spears, shields, and short swords. They practiced formations. They ran long distances. They sparred in pairs and groups. Injuries were common. Sympathy was rare. What held them together was not just fear of punishment, but a shared identity. They were Spartans, and Spartans were different. Unlike other Greek cities, where boys might study music, philosophy, or trade, Sparta rejected softness. It rejected luxury. It rejected anything that didn't serve the goal of national defense. The agoge was not a phase, it was a transformation. By the time a boy reached 18, he wasn't just expected to be strong. He was expected to be unbreakable. At that age, if he passed his trials, he could enter military service, but not as a full citizen. That would come later. First, he had to prove himself again, through more tests, more combat, and possibly participation in the crypteia. And yet, even in this bleak, relentless environment, many Spartans took pride in their upbringing. The discipline, the pain, the silence, they believed it made them superior, stronger than the Athenians, whom they saw as soft, more resilient than the Persians, whom they saw as decadent. But what happened to the boys who didn't fit in? The ones who couldn't keep up, who fell ill, or who simply broke under the pressure? In most cases, they were removed from the program. Some were assigned lower civic roles. Others were never granted full Spartan citizenship, a rare and exclusive status. The consequences of failure were social invisibility, and for those who succeeded, they were now ready to be real Spartans, soldiers of the state. But even then, their life wasn't entirely their own. They couldn't live with their wives until age 30. They continued to dine in military mess halls. Their loyalty remained. First to Sparta. So how did these boys, now young men, transition into full warriors? And what did it mean to be a Spartan on the battlefield? By the time a Spartan male reached his late teens, he had endured over a decade of pain, silence, and obedience. He had been whipped publicly, gone hungry by design, learned to fight with fists and words, and been shaped, not just into a warrior, but into a citizen of Sparta. Yet even after all of this, he was still not truly a man in the eyes of his society. That final transformation would come only through war, or more often, through one of Sparta's most peculiar institutions, the crypteia. The crypteia was a state-sanctioned rite of passage cloaked in shadows and cruelty. Members were handpicked from among the most promising youths of the agoge. They were given a dagger, a few supplies, and sent into the countryside under cover of night. Their mission? To live off the land, observe the enslaved helot population, and, if commanded, eliminate any helot who showed signs of resistance, leadership, or defiance. This wasn't battle. It wasn't even espionage in the modern sense. It was psychological control, a terrifying reminder to the helots, the agricultural slaves who vastly outnumbered Spartan citizens, that they were always being watched and always within reach of a silent knife. To outsiders, this might seem cruel beyond measure, but to Spartans it was necessity. Their society depended on a small elite controlling a vast enslaved population. Fear was the glue that held it all together. And so, the crypteia was both a test of survival and an introduction to authority. A young man who survived it proved not only that he could live like a predator in the wilderness, but that he would do what was required to protect the Spartan way of life. After this phase, typically around age 20, the youth officially entered military service. He joined the ranks of the Syssitia, the mess halls where Spartan warriors dined and bonded. This was no mere cafeteria. Membership in a Syssian was mandatory for full citizenship. If you were not accepted into one, often based on a vote, by existing members, you would never be a true Spartan, regardless of your training. In these mess halls, men shared meals of barley bread, cheese, figs, and that famously bitter black broth. Each man was expected to contribute food and wine monthly, often through his helots. Meals weren't for pleasure. They were rituals of equality, of readiness, of discipline. Conversation was expected to be minimal, precise, and clever. Meanwhile, even if a Spartan married, and many did in their early 20s, he was not allowed to live with his wife. That only came at age 30. Until then, his duty remained to his brothers in arms. Marriage was, in a way, a secondary citizenship. War came first, and then came the true test of the Spartan warrior, battle. Unlike most other Greek soldiers, the Spartans were professional. Their entire society was built around being ready for war at any moment. They trained in the phalanx formation, standing shoulder to shoulder, their massive shields overlapping to form a wall. Courage wasn't about rushing forward, it was about standing still. In fact, more than bravery, the Spartans prized discipline. The hoplites' job wasn't to kill many enemies, it was to hold the line, to never break formation, to never retreat. And here is where one of the most misunderstood pieces of Spartan culture comes into play. The famous line, often misquoted as, "Come back with your shield, or on it." What a Spartan mother actually meant was this: if you lose your shield, you've lost your duty to the phalanx. The shield protected your comrade to the left. To abandon it was not cowardice, it was betrayal. In battle, the Spartans were feared. They moved in silence. They attacked in unison. They died without screaming. At the Battle of Thermopylae, 300 Spartans, along with a few thousand allies, faced an enormous Persian army. They knew they would die. They stayed anyway. And when they did die, they became immortalized, not just in poems or monuments, but in the identity of Sparta itself. But what happened after a Spartan reached age 30? Surprisingly, that's when he became a full citizen, a homoios, meaning equal. He could now vote in the Apella, the Spartan assembly, live with his wife and own property. But he was still expected to remain on military duty until age 60. Even in later years, Spartan men trained regularly. They served as mentors to the younger generation, as trainers in the agoge, and as guards of the city. Retirement wasn't a release from duty. It was simply a change in role. And then, after a lifetime of silence, suffering, and sacrifice, a Spartan might be honored in death, but only under very specific conditions. For men, only those who died in battle or during childbirth, yes, childbirth keen, but only for women, were eligible for marked tombstones. Everyone else was buried in unmarked graves. Sparta had no patience for vanity. So what did this system produce? Certainly Sparta created some of the most disciplined soldiers in ancient history. They were admired and feared. But it also produced a rigid society, one that did not adapt well to change. Over time, Sparta's population declined. They resisted trade, rejected new ideas, and clung to traditions long after they had lost relevance. Wealth began to concentrate among a few families. The number of full citizens, those who had completed the agoge and been accepted into Syssitia, shrank dramatically. By the time of the Roman Empire, Sparta was more museum than menace. Tourists would visit to watch Spartan youths perform staged rituals. The agoge became a kind of performance art. The sharp discipline softened into nostalgia. The same city that had once trained boys to kill helots in silence was now training boys to reenact their legacy for Roman guests. And so, the system that had forged warriors became a memory, rigid, legendary, and slowly irrelevant. But still, questions linger. What did it cost to build such strength? What tenderness was lost in the process? And how many children cried in the dark with no mother to hold them because Sparta believed that softness was a threat? Even the strongest societies must ask, What is the price of survival and who pays it? In most ancient Greek cities, dinner was a moment of relief, a gathering of family, food and laughter. Olive oil and wine flowed freely. The evening meal, or deipnon, was about comfort, company and celebration. But in Sparta, dinner was different. In Sparta, dinner was duty. To understand the Spartan dining mess, known as the Syssician, is to understand the bones of their society. It was not a restaurant, not a tavern, not even a military canteen. It was a rite, a requirement, a daily reminder that you were not an individual. You were a cog in the machine, a brother among equals, and everything, including your food, belonged to the state. Every full Spartan citizen, or homoios, was required to be part of a Syssician. It was non-negotiable. These were small groups of around 15 men, often bonded by age or military unit. They ate together every single night, and absence without an extremely good reason meant expulsion. Not just from the dining group, but from citizenship itself. That's right, if you didn't show up to dinner, you weren't considered Spartan anymore. The food itself was functional, not delightful, not creative, not seasonal. Spartan cuisine was famously plain, even by ancient standards. And at the center of this plainness was one dish that has haunted the legacy of Spartan gastronomy. Ever since black broth or melas zomos, what was black broth? The ingredients, as recorded by other Greeks, were simple and stark. Pig's blood, vinegar, salt, and boiled pork. That's it. A dark, soupy concoction that smelled metallic and tasted, according to non-Spartan accounts, absolutely awful. Itty. Had a purpose, though. Blood was rich in iron. The vinegar preserved it. The simplicity mirrored the Spartan ideal. Nothing fancy, nothing wasted, nothing sweet. Just what was needed to sustain strength. Nothing more. In fact, one visiting Greek from Sybaris, a famously luxurious city, is said to have spat it out and remarked that only Spartans could enjoy such horror, and only because they'd never tasted anything better. But not everything in the Syssician was so grim. There was also bread, figs, cheese, and occasionally meat, usually from communal hunts or sacrifices. Wine was served too, but in strict moderation. Drunkenness was frowned upon. Self-control was everything. What made the Syssician special wasn't the menu, it was the meaning. Joining a Syssician was a rite of passage. It wasn't automatic. A young man's around age 20 had to be voted into a mess group by its current members. A single black bean cast in secret was enough to reject the applicant, and that rejection carried serious consequences. If you weren't accepted into a Syssician, you could not become a full citizen. This voting system ensured cohesion. You didn't just share meals, you shared loyalty, trust, discipline, humor, when permitted. Each night's meal was a continuation of the agoge, the education system that had drilled silence and endurance into Spartan boys. The food may have been dull, but the conversation was sharp. Spartan men were encouraged to speak in short, witty bursts, a verbal continuation of their physical training. The laconic style, that dry, economical way of speaking, was practiced here nightly. A well-placed insult was more prized than a long argument. At the Cessation, men also shared war stories, debated politics, and critiqued one another's behavior. It was a social court as much as a dinner table. If a man had behaved dishonorably in public, his messmates would know, and they would say so. Eating together meant accountability. Each man was required to contribute to the mess from his own allotment. Food, wine, and sometimes game from hunts. These contributions were tracked. Fail to provide and you risked expulsion. This was Sparta's way of ensuring that citizenship was tied to responsibility, not wealth. Even if you were rich, if you didn't uphold your duties, having to fight, to share, to show up, you were no longer part of the group. The Cessation, then, was more than a meal. It was a daily rehearsal of Spartan ideals, simplicity, brotherhood, and unyielding control over the self. And yet one might ask, did anyone ever enjoy these meals? Perhaps. Not in the sense of pleasure, but in the sense of belonging. The Spartan system was harsh, but it created an unusual kind of intimacy. These were the men you would fight beside, bleed beside, die beside. To eat with them was to affirm your place among them. There were no private tables, no special treatment. Even kings dined in Cilicia, eating the same food as common soldiers. That was the idea anyway, though in practice, Spartan kings had more leeway, especially in wartime. And what of guests? Were outsiders ever allowed in occasionally? Visiting dignitaries were sometimes invited, and they rarely enjoyed it. The food shocked them. The austerity was offensive. One Athenian joked that Sparta had no need for walls. Its food would keep invaders away. But that was precisely the point. Spartan meals weren't meant to charm. They were meant to harden. If a guest recoiled at the black broth, good. It meant he wasn't one of them. Still, the Cilicia weren't joyless. There was laughter, there were jokes, there were bonds that lasted lifetimes. Even Spartan children, those still in the agoge, were sometimes invited to sit at the edges and listen, to absorb the values of their elders. It was both dinner and lesson. But what happened when someone didn't show up? When a man failed to bring his share of food, or drank too much, or showed weakness in front of his messmates? Punishments varied. He might be mocked, or shamed, or, in rare cases, removed. And in Sparta, to be cast out of your Cessation was to become an outsider. A man without a mess was a man without a city. As the years passed and Sparta's power waned, the Cilicia remained. Even in decline, the tradition endured, though by the Hellenistic period it had begun to lose its edge. The groups grew smaller, standards slipped, and eventually the ritual became more symbolic than essential. But for several centuries the Cessation was the beating heart of Spartan male life, as defining as their bronze shields or crimson cloaks. Why did such a system endure? What did it say about a society that measured loyalty in loaves and broth? And could it be that in the quiet candlelit moments after the meal, when the jokes had faded and the wine was low, even a Spartan might have longed for something softer? By now you've seen that the Spartan dining mess, the Cessation, was not a place to enjoy a hearty meal after a long day's work. It was not where men gathered to indulge, rest, or loosen their belts. It was more like a nightly test. Let's now explore how these messes shaped the deeper rhythms of Spartan life, the social dynamics, expectations, silent codes of conduct, and even the quiet rebellions that would never be shouted across the table, only noticed in the shuffle of bread or the tightening of a jaw. Once a young Spartan man joined a Cessation around age 20, the act wasn't a celebration. There was no feast in his honor, no ceremony of applause. Instead, there was just a seat made available, assuming he had passed the vote of inclusion, where even one dissenting voice meant exclusion. This was not a group of friends. It was a mandatory state-structured fellowship. Whether you liked the men around you or not, you had to eat with them, laugh with them, hunt and bleed beside them. And if war came, you had to trust them with your life. It's worth remembering. In ancient Sparta, your real family, your parents, your siblings, even your wife, were secondary to the bond you had with your messmates. The group came first. Even love came second. The table was both boundary and glue. You had to contribute to the mess monthly. A fixed portion of barley, wine, cheese, figs, and money for meat, usually from wild game, which encouraged hunting as a civic duty. If you missed your quota, even once, without a compelling excuse, your place in the secession could be revoked, and if that happened, you didn't just lose a seat, you lost citizenship, permanently. That's because in Sparta, citizenship wasn't something you were born into, it was something you proved. You had to survive the agoge, pass the vote of the secession, and then maintain your contributions and presence every month. These obligations were your civic backbone, more important than money, inheritance, or family name. And so even when food was scarce, or a man grew sick, or times turned lean, he had to contribute. Many used helot labor to farm their land and pay these dues. Others struggled, some failed. It created a quiet tension beneath the surface of the so-called Spartan equality. While all citizens were technically equals, homoioi, some were far more equal than others, especially those with more productive land or wealth hidden in plain sight. Within the secession, hierarchy still existed. Senior members could dominate conversations. Younger men were expected to listen more than they spoke, but this wasn't age-based only, it was status-based. A man known for bravery in battle, or one descended from a respected line, could command the tone of the table. Conversations were often sparse, but they carried weight. One well-placed joke, one sharp observation, or one moment of verbal courage could change a man's standing among his messmates. This verbal culture, brief, biting, and brilliant, was not just personality, it was policy. Spartan boys were trained from childhood to be laconic, to speak with precision, say less, and convey more. Wasting words was considered weak. The mess hall was where this culture was kept sharp. Like their blades, the walls of the mess knew secrets, grudges, praise, even quiet acts of rebellion. You see, not every Spartan man agreed with every Spartan law, but the secession was not a place to debate openly. Instead, if a man disagreed with how a commander had handled a battle, or how harsh a punishment had been in the agoge, or how the kings were spending Spartan resources, he might reveal it in a joke. A comment, a line delivered flatly but meaningfully. In this way, the mess was both a space of unity and a pressure valve, and not all men were equal in how they were treated, even at the same table. Consider the treatment of men who had, for one reason or another, failed in battle, not by running away, but simply by surviving in situations where others died. The Spartans had a word for such men, tresantes, or tremblers. These were not cowards in the traditional sense. They had not abandoned the phalanx or fled the field, but they had perhaps returned alive when others hadn't. And in Sparta, even survival could be suspicious. A tresus might still sit at the mess, but no one would speak to him. Bread would be passed without eye contact. Wine poured without a word. His presence would be allowed, but his status quietly erased. In such an environment, silence could be a weapon. The secession could also serve as a breeding ground for quiet dissent. When Sparta declined in the later centuries, some younger Spartans began to question the rigidity of their society. They observed how the number of full citizens had dropped from over 8,000 in the classical period to barely a few hundred by the Hellenistic age. Why? Because the rules never changed. A man who couldn't join a secession, whether because of politics, poverty, or bad luck, was not a citizen. And Sparta never adapted. Instead of adjusting, it shrank. This decline would be whispered about in the mess halls, not shouted, not debated in assemblies, but murmured. A joke about rising food quotas, a comment about empty seats, an observation that more and more messes were merging because they couldn't fill tables. And yet, the ritual endured. Even as Sparta began accepting outsiders, neodemodeus, and loosening its strict codes, the secession remained. Hollowed, perhaps. Symbolic, but still central. Even in the 2nd century BCE, when Sparta had become a Roman curiosity, visitors could still observe young Spartan boys sitting near the mess halls, watching older men eat black broth in silence, enduring jokes, enduring hunger, enduring history. Was this dedication or denial? Let us also consider the women. Spartan women, famously freer than other Greek women, did not eat in Syssitia, but they knew their function. Their sons would train for them, their husbands would leave them at home, and their power, which was real, did not extend to the communal table. Instead, they formed their own circles, often around childbirth, land management, and household control. They ran estates, issued orders to helots, and trained daughters to be strong in body and will. But the Syssition was a male ritual, an unbroken line of camaraderie, service, and expectation. What did Spartan boys feel as they watched these meals? Perhaps a mixture of fear and longing. One day they would take a seat, but they would have to earn it, not with charm, not with family name, but with obedience, strength, and the willingness to be silent while others judged them. As time wore on, some Syssitia adapted. By the Roman period, mess halls became more ceremonial, used to impress tourists, act out history, and serve as symbols of a vanishing age. The black broth was still made, but it had become a performance. Still, the ghost of the real Syssition lingered. It remained in records, in memory, in the cautionary tales of what happens when a society values structure over softness, routine over reflection. So, when a Spartan dipped his bread into pig's blood and raised his cup in silence, was he honoring tradition or simply repeating it? And when the stew cooled and the jokes faded and the wine ran out, what was left in the air? Was it duty or emptiness? The Syssition was never just about dinner, that much is clear. It was about control, about brotherhood, about sameness. It was how Sparta made sure its citizens were living embodiments of its laws, not merely warriors, but participants in an ongoing ritual of simplicity and service. And yet, like every tradition bound tightly to a rigid system, the Syssition eventually faced the slow erosion of time. To understand how it faded, we have to trace the shifting landscape of Spartan society, not just on the battlefield, but in the fields of politics, economics, and even population. At its peak, during the 5th century BCE, Sparta had thousands of full male citizens, homoioi, and every one of them was required to participate in a Syssition. The structure was strong, self-reinforcing, and deeply integrated into the Spartan machine. But by the time of the Peloponnesian War, cracks had already begun to appear. Many Spartans died in battle, and as the state refused to bend its strict citizenship rules, namely the requirement of surviving the agoge, being voted into a mess group and making consistent contributions, the citizen population began to decline. By the 3rd century BCE, there were reports of fewer than 700 full Spartan citizens, and yet the number of helots, the enslaved majority, remained high, as did the number of perioikoi, the free but non-citizen tradespeople who lived in the surrounding villages. Sparta was hollowing out from the inside, and the Syssitia were one of the clearest signs of this decline. Mess groups that once brimmed with voices, wit, and duty began to dwindle. It became harder to fill quotas, harder to maintain unity, and yet the law remained the same. No Syssition membership, no citizenship. The irony was obvious. Sparta, the city that prided itself on discipline and order, was collapsing because it refused to adapt. It had too few citizens to govern, too many non-citizens to ignore, and traditions that couldn't flex without breaking. Attempts at reform were made. One such reformer was King Agis IV in the 3rd century BCE, who tried to redistribute land and expand citizenship. He wanted to revive the Syssitia, strengthen Spartan numbers, and restore the old laws, the so-called Retra of Lycurgus, the legendary lawgiver. But his reforms failed. He was executed. Another reformer, Cleomenes III, tried again, forcibly redistributing land, cancelling debts, and attempting to refill the mess halls with new citizens. But these efforts, too, were temporary. Sparta had become a relic. By the time the Romans arrived, Sparta was a curiosity, a museum of virtue. The agoge was now more performance than preparation. Boys still trained, but their whippings and songs were observed by tourists, not feared by rivals. The Syssitia, too, became a demonstration, a reenactment of ancient austerity. Roman senators and emperors wrote about their visits to Sparta with bemused admiration. They watched the Spartans dip bread into black broth. They chuckled at the brevity of their jokes. But even they understood the edge was gone. The tradition had outlived the society. And what about the meals themselves, and what did they symbolize now? To the few remaining Spartans, perhaps they were nostalgic, or sacred, or simply habit. The ritual of showing up, breaking bread, and repeating old stories might have felt like continuity. But in truth, it was survival, of a kind. A table once, used to bind warriors, was now a stage, a shell, an echo. Still, the legacy of the secession endured far beyond its last bowl of black broth. In political theory, it became a symbol of radical equality, admired by thinkers like Plato and criticized by others for its inhumanity. In modern military culture, echoes of Spartan mess life appear in tight-knit unit dining, code of silence, traditions, and the enduring myth of strength through shared suffering. But the deeper story is more complex. What does it mean to belong, if that belonging is conditional? What happens to a society when inclusion is based not on contribution or compassion, but on conformity? The secession asked its citizens to show up every night, to eat the same food, drink the same wine, speak the same way, laugh at the same jokes, and those who couldn't, they disappeared. They were Trisants, the tremblers, or Hypermiones, the lesser men, or simply nameless, forgotten, men without mess groups and thus without a voice. We might admire the discipline, the simplicity, the strength, but we must also remember the cost. The cost of black broth wasn't just its taste. It was the silence it demanded, the sameness it enforced, the voices it left out. So when you imagine those candle-lit meals in ancient Sparta, quiet men hunched over simple bowls, ask yourself, were they united or were they alone together? In most ancient Greek city-states, women were expected to be quiet, invisible, and obedient. Their lives were lived indoors, away from the agora, away from politics, and very much away from power. But not in Sparta. In Sparta, women trained. They owned land, they raised their voices in public, and they issued commands, sometimes to men. To the rest of Greece, Spartan women seemed strange, even scandalous. But to the Spartans themselves, it was simply the natural result of their system. Let's start at the beginning, with the birth of a Spartan girl. Unlike boys, newborn Spartan girls were not subjected to the harsh inspection of the elders at the apothetae. The state's interest in boys stemmed from their military role. Girls were not expected to fight. But that didn't mean they were unimportant. Quite the opposite. The state needed mothers, strong ones. It was believed that only a strong woman could birth out and raise but a strong warrior. This was not a sentimental notion. It was strategic. Spartan mothers were viewed as the first instructors in the art of Spartan discipline. They were the first barrier between weakness and strength. So girls, like boys, were raised to be tough. They exercised in public, running, wrestling, throwing javelins. They were taught to be proud of their strength and to avoid laziness. Their bodies were not hidden, nor were their achievements. The Spartans believed that a healthy woman would bear healthy children. Beauty was not the goal. Functionality was. This was revolutionary in the Greek world. In Athens, women were legally children their entire lives. They could not own property, vote, or appear in court without a male guardian. They lived largely confined to the gynekonitis, the women's quarters of the home. But Spartan women moved freely. They spoke to men, they managed estates, and perhaps most scandalously to other Greeks, they could inherit and own land. In fact, by the 4th century BCE, Spartan women are estimated to have owned nearly 40% of the land in Laconia. That figure shocked contemporary writers. To them, land meant power, and women weren't supposed to have either. How did this happen? It was partly due to war. Spartan men were away constantly, at the agoge, at training, on campaigns. They died in large numbers. This left women to manage households, direct helot laborers, and ensure that contributions to the syssitia were met. In a society where failure to contribute meant loss of citizenship, women effectively held the keys to civic survival. Over time, their influence grew, and while they still could not vote or serve in the assembly, they wielded informal power, especially over their sons, husbands, and estates. Marriage in Sparta was also different. Weddings were brief, unceremonious affairs, sometimes even bizarre. A woman's head would be shaved. She would be dressed in a man's cloak and sandals, left alone in a dark room. The groom would visit secretly. It was ritual, meant to ease the transition from boyhood training to married life. Even after marriage, men lived in the barracks until age 30. Husbands visited wives in secret or during brief intervals. Wives ran the household, not in submission, but in command. And yet, despite this autonomy, Spartan women were not free in the modern sense. Their roles were still shaped by the needs of the state. Their purpose was still linked to reproduction, not personal ambition. They were valued, but in a functional way. Still, their confidence became legendary. Other Greeks found Spartan women intimidating. They spoke their minds. They made jokes. They trained their sons to be fearless and showed no public sorrow when those sons died in battle. One of the most famous sayings attributed to a Spartan mother is, "Return with your shield, or on it." This wasn't cruel, it was culture. A mother who cried at a funeral might shame her family, but a mother who stood silent, chin high, was admired. Girls, too, were expected to embrace this ethos early. They were praised for their boldness, their wit, and their strength. Female education in Sparta focused less on books and more on presence, confidence, physical readiness, and pride in the Spartan way. But what about love? What about softness? There are few romantic tales from Sparta. Love poems existed, but they were subdued. Public affection was rare. Duty, not emotion, was the measure of a relationship. Even within households, roles were structured around responsibility. A wife might run the farm, direct servants, and manage accounts, but her success would be measured by how well her family served the state. Still, some records suggest affection existed, just quietly, in songs, in shared glances, in the pride of a mother seeing her son rise through the agoge. As Sparta declined in later centuries, so did the unique position of women. Land ownership concentrated in fewer hands, the population shrank. And though women retained some influence, their role became more symbolic, much like the agoge and the syssitia. But during its height, the freedom of Spartan women stood in stark contrast to the rest of Greece. They were admired, feared, mocked, and never ignored. So what did it mean to be a woman in ancient Sparta? Was it empowerment, or was it utility wrapped in dignity? Was it liberation, or simply a different kind of leash? We'll explore the contradictions more deeply in the next section, where we examine how Spartan women lived day to day, managing farms, raising sons, and navigating a city built for war. Sparta was a city defined by its men, its warriors, its kings, its battles. But behind the shields and spears was another story, quieter but no less important. A story written in land deeds, in grain storage, in whispered commands to helot laborers, and in the cool composure of women who knew they were being watched. If Spartan men were bred for war, Spartan women were bred to run everything else. Let's begin with one of the most remarkable facts in ancient history. Spartan women could own land. This was not just a loophole or a rare exception. It was a common reality. And it stood in stark contrast to nearly every other major Greek city, where women could not own property, could not inherit directly, and often couldn't even leave the house without permission. But in Sparta, women not only inherited land from their fathers, they often acquired more upon the death of husbands and brothers lost in war. Over generations, this created a strange economic fact. By the 4th century BCE, Spartan women are believed to have controlled nearly 2/5 of all private land in Laconia. Why did this happen? Partly because the system depended on it. Spartan men could not farm. They were legally required to live a life of military service, often away from their estates. And while helots, the state-owned slave class, did the manual labor, they needed someone to manage them. Enter the women, Spartan. Wives and mothers were more than caretakers. They were estate managers, responsible for overseeing agricultural production, ensuring that quotas for the Syssitia were met, and maintaining the wealth and functionality of the household. This wasn't an honorary role. It was economic power, real, visible, and respected. They interacted directly with helots, gave orders, calculated resources, and made decisions that could impact not just their family, but the state's fragile food supply. And this power wasn't hidden. It was acknowledged, sometimes begrudgingly, by male contemporaries. Aristotle, no great fan of Spartan women, once lamented that Sparta is a state run by women. He was exaggerating, of course, but his irritation reveals something important. Spartan women had agency. Enough that even philosophers noticed. But what did this look like on a daily basis? Imagine a Spartan woman, perhaps 30 years old, standing at the edge of her olive grove. Her husband is away training or perhaps serving on a campaign. She oversees the helots as they prune trees, harvest grain, or tend to livestock. She checks the storerooms. She tracks how much barley and wine must be sent for her husband's Syssition. She ensures the farm is producing enough to support the family's standing and citizenship. At home, she educates her daughters in strength and poise. She hosts gatherings with other women, not for idle gossip, but to exchange news, settle minor disputes, and perhaps even influence decisions indirectly through their sons. Her words carry weight. Her posture is proud. She does not need permission to speak in public. She does not walk 2 steps behind. And when her son returns home from the agoge on brief leave, she does not coddle him. She tests him. If he seems too soft, she reprimands. If he speaks too freely, she corrects. This is not maternal warmth as we might imagine it. It is maternal duty, forged in the same fires as the Spartan shield. Interestingly, Spartan girls often married later than their counterparts in other cities, usually in their late teens, as opposed to the Athenian norm of 13 or 14. This allowed them to grow physically stronger and more emotionally mature before childbearing, aligning with the state's emphasis on health and strength. Their weddings, as we touched on before, were brief, even strange. After being captured in a symbolic abduction by the groom, the bride's head was shaved, and she was dressed in male clothing, a symbolic blurring of roles, or perhaps a nod to the belief that Spartan men had to be eased into adulthood and domesticity. These marriages were often practical. Love was not the central idea, and legacy was. A woman's duty was to bear strong sons for Sparta and to raise them with the same stoic pride she had learned, and yet love was not absent. We know of Spartan poems and songs that speak of beauty, of admiration, of longing. Relationships may have been shaped by state needs, but human emotions still pulsed beneath the bronze. Women in Sparta also had cultural roles, especially in religion. They participated in and sometimes led festivals, rituals, and dances. Certain deities like Artemis and Helen had strong Spartan connections, and women were central to their worship. During these ceremonies, Spartan girls performed choral dances and races, often publicly. Their physical grace was considered a virtue, not a danger to modesty. To the rest of Greece, this seemed scandalous. To the Spartans, it was natural. But what about politics? Spartan women could not vote or hold office, but they could influence. Through economic power, through family networks, and through their sons, they shaped opinion. A well-respected woman could shame a man into action, could advise her husband privately, could raise a son who would speak her wisdom in the Apella. There's even a record of Gorgo, wife of King Leonidas, advising men on matters of state, and delivering cutting political remarks with classic Spartan brevity. Gorgo was once asked why Spartan women were the only ones who rule men. Her reply, "Because we are the only ones who give birth to men." It's hard to argue with that. Still, even with their power, Spartan women were not revolutionaries. They did not try to dismantle the system. They operated within it, shaping it from behind, holding up its structure, but never seeking to overturn it. In time, that system would falter. As the number of full citizens declined, wealth became concentrated in the hands of fewer and fewer families, many of them controlled by women through inheritance. This led to economic imbalance, political stagnation, and increasing tension within Spartan society. Efforts to reform land ownership, such as those attempted by Agis IV and Cleomenes III, often targeted this concentration of property, much of it held by women. These reforms failed, but the fact that they were proposed at all shows how central women had become to the state's economy. Eventually, as Sparta lost its military edge and became more symbolic than strategic, the unique role of its women faded into history. But their legacy remains. They were not rebels, but they were radical. They did not command armies, but they commanded respect. They were mothers, landowners, estate managers, and silent power brokers. And they stood always at the heart of Sparta's survival. In the next section, we'll look more closely at what happened to these women as Sparta declined. How did they react to change? Did they resist or adapt? And what was left of their influence when the swords were finally sheathed? Sparta was never conquered in the traditional sense. It didn't fall to siege engines or foreign armies. Instead, it unraveled, thread by thread, family by family, rule by unbending rule. And when it did, the women, once so central to its strange and severe order, found themselves standing in the quiet, holding pieces of a fading world. By the Hellenistic period, roughly the 3rd to 1st centuries BCE, Sparta was no longer the ironclad city of Leonidas and black broth. It had become something else, a place of echoes, tradition, and uneasy nostalgia. Tourists visited. Roman aristocrats admired the rituals, but the core was hollowing, and with that hollowing came changes, subtle at first, then irreversible, for Spartan women. Their earlier power, based on land, lineage, and responsibility, began to shift. As the number of homoioi, full male citizens, plummeted due to wars and rigid rules of succession, women inherited more land. But this didn't bring them freedom. It brought imbalance. Aristotle had warned about this centuries earlier. He saw it not as a triumph of gender equality, but as a symptom of a decaying system. Nearly 2/5 of the land is held by women, he wrote with disapproval. Not because he feared women's power in itself, but because he saw it as a break in the chain of order. Indeed, by the 3rd century BCE, just a handful of wealthy families, often led by widows or daughters, controlled vast estates. This concentrated wealth, in turn, reduced the economic mobility of lower-class Spartans, leading to tensions, poverty, and reforms that never quite reformed enough. The women who once ran farms and managed helots now found themselves at the top of a crumbling pyramid. The state tried to fix it. There were efforts to redistribute land, to create new citizens, to curtail the concentration of property. But these reforms, noble or desperate, mostly failed. The system had waited too long to bend, and so it began to break. Meanwhile, daily life for Spartan women continued, but with less certainty. They still managed estates, but their sons were fewer. Their husbands were gone longer. Their role as proud mothers of warriors began to fade, as Sparta engaged in fewer and fewer meaningful wars. Military strength was no longer a given. And the glory of raising a son to die at Thermopylae? That was now myth, not policy. Girls still trained in athletics, running, javelin, discus, but less for the state and more for tradition. The sharp edge of purpose dulled, the dances continued, the rituals endured, but they were imitations of something that once mattered more deeply. Some women adapted. They became patrons of temples, of civic events, of poetry and music. Others preserved what they could, maintaining old songs, old jokes, old postures. Some undoubtedly questioned their place in this new Sparta. Some likely clung to the ideals that had once given their lives shape and status. But the power that Spartan women once wielded, grounded in the unique needs of a society at war, was slipping. Without the agoge to define boys, without the secession to test men, without the endless campaigns to justify the system, Sparta's entire social fabric softened. And with it, the roles that had once empowered women began to feel like ceremonial garments in a changing world. Still, the outside world continued to marvel. Roman authors wrote about Spartan women with a mix of curiosity and admiration. They praised their independence. They retold the sayings and stories, some true, some surely embellished, about mothers who told their sons to return with their shields, or not at all. One popular Roman tale spoke of a Spartan woman whose son fled from battle. When he returned home, she killed him herself. Another tells of a mother who received news of her son's death in war and responded, "He was mine, but Sparta is more." Were these true? Possibly, or possibly not. But they became part of the myth, part of the image of Spartan womanhood. Cold, proud, unshakable. In truth, real Spartan women were likely more complex, proud, yes, but also practical, capable of grief as well as endurance. We just don't hear those quieter stories, the weeping in private, the long years of widowhood, the loneliness of power without companionship. In time, as Sparta became absorbed into the Roman world, its laws softened, its military might vanished, and its unique social structures, including the roles of women, were increasingly absorbed by more conventional Hellenistic norms. By the 2nd century CE, a visitor to Sparta might still see girls racing or dancing in honor of Artemis. He might still hear echoes of old songs, but the estate-managing, land-owning, fearsome mothers of warriors, they were ghosts in the stones. Still, something lingered. In the ruins of Sparta's economy, in the fading songs of its rituals, in the half-remembered sayings of its women, there was a legacy, a reminder that history is not just made by generals and kings, but by those who hold the line at home. Spartan women didn't fight on the battlefield, but they fought nonetheless, for survival, for stability for their sons and households. Their rights were born of necessity, not ideology. Their power was shaped by state needs, not liberation movements. But in that space, narrow though it was, they found a kind of independence nearly unheard of in their time. So what does it mean? Were Spartan women the earliest feminists? Probably. Not, at least not in the way we use the term today. They didn't seek to overturn the world, only to manage it within the walls they were given. And yet, their lives complicate our picture of the ancient past. They show us that, even in a system built on obedience, some people found ways to shape their destiny. That even in a city built for war, someone had to sow the wheat, manage the helots, and keep the torches burning. And they remind us, gently, firmly, that history is rarely as simple as it seems. So when you think of Sparta, don't think only of bronze shields and spear points. Think also of the woman standing at the edge of the olive grove, watching her workers with a clear eye. She didn't fight at Thermopylae, but she raised the man who did. Of all the institutions in ancient Sparta, few have been as disturbing, or as shadowed in silence, as the crypteia. It wasn't a military unit, not officially. And it wasn't quite a rite of passage, though it functioned like one. It was a kind of state-sponsored stealth patrol, composed of Spartan teenagers, selected from among the most promising graduates of the agoge, and sent into the night armed only with daggers. Their mission? Watch the helots, intimidate them, and when commanded, eliminate. But this wasn't war, it was something colder. To understand the crypteia, you have to understand the strange and chilling balance at the heart of Spartan society. The Spartans were vastly outnumbered by the helots, the enslaved population who farmed their land and kept their society functioning. Without the helots, there was no Sparta. The helots were mostly Messenian, people conquered generations earlier and reduced to serfdom. They lived in scattered villages, worked the fields, raised the food, and handed over a significant portion of their crops to their Spartan masters. They were not bought and sold like chattel slaves, but they were not free. They were bound to the land and the state. They could be humiliated, beaten, even killed, without recourse. And they outnumbered the Spartans by as much as 7-1, which meant that fear had to be constant. And the crypteia was fear, institutionalized, every year. According to some sources, the Spartan government would declare a kind of mock war on the helot population. This wasn't symbolic. It served a legal purpose. It allowed Spartans, including crypteia members, to kill helots without religious penalty. Then, under the cover of darkness, selected young men, often 18 or 19 years old, were sent out alone. No torches, no horses, no companions, just cloaks and daggers. They weren't given rations, they had to survive off the land, like predators. Their objective wasn't to fight battles. It was to observe, to move silently through helot villages, to identify the most vocal, the most confident, the ones who stood too tall, who spoke too loudly, who looked like they might lead a rebellion. Those were the targets. The crypteia would return before dawn. And some helots would not see another sunrise. To the Spartans, this was not murder. It was maintenance, a brutal necessity. The helots worked the land, but they were never allowed to feel safe. And the boys sent into the night. They were being tested, not just for courage, but for silence, for obedience, for their ability to become more than human, to become tools of the state. We don't know how many youths participated each year. We don't know if all crypteia missions ended in violence, but we do know this. Membership in the crypteia was seen as an honor, a reward for excellence in the agoge. Imagine being 17 and told you had been selected for the crypteia. You would have already endured years of hunger, beatings, silence, and discipline. You would have learned to fight, to steal, to endure. Pain without flinching. Now you are being told, prove yourself in the shadows, and so barefoot, cloaked, you disappeared into the night. Your task was not to fight a foreign enemy. It was to patrol your own population, to show strength not with swords, but with the chill of unseen eyes. What did these young men feel? Did they believe in the mission? Were they proud? Were they afraid? They couldn't have said so. Not in public. Not in Sparta. Not where weakness or even questioning could mark you forever. The crypteia was rarely spoken of. Even in historical records, it appears more as a rumor, a whisper, than a documented institution. Plato mentioned it. So did Aristotle. Later Roman writers embellished it, but within Sparta itself the details remained deliberately vague. That was part of its power. You couldn't predict when the crypteia would strike, or where, or how many of them there were. They were not a formal guard. They were not seen. And what isn't seen isn't safe. This wasn't random cruelty. It was methodical psychological warfare. It sent a clear message to the helots. You may till the fields, but you do not own them. You may raise children, but you may not raise your voices. You are watched, always. And for the boys who survived the crypteia, they returned changed. Some were promoted. Others became full citizens. Many rose through military ranks faster. They had proven that they could live alone. Kill alone. Survive in darkness. But what scars did they carry? We don't know. Spartan culture did not encourage reflection. There were no confessions, no public remorse, just silence. And yet, behind that silence, surely there was something. The crypteia sits uneasily in Spartan legacy. It is not recited in patriotic hymns. It is not celebrated on old monuments. It was practical, efficient, and deeply troubling. Other Greeks found it horrifying. Even Athens, which had its own forms of brutality, looked at the crypteia with unease. It was not warfare. It was suppression. So was it necessary? To the Spartans it was. Without constant pressure, they believed, the helots would rise. And indeed, there were helot uprisings, notably after the great earthquake in the 460s BCE, when thousands of Spartans died and the helots rebelled. Perhaps the crypteia was born from that fear. Or perhaps it had always existed, just hidden like its members. What kind of society creates a unit like this? A society built on imbalance, on fear, on control. A society that trains its sons not just to fight enemies, but to quietly dominate those it fears beneath them. In the next section, we'll explore how the crypteia shaped not just its members, but Spartan society as a whole, and what the long-term cost of institutionalized silence and fear really was. To understand the long reach of the crypteia, we have to look not only at the boys who were sent into the night, but at the city that trained them to do so. Sparta, as we know, was not a democracy. It was not a monarchy either, at least not in the usual sense. It was a strange hybrid. Two kings ruled jointly, but only within limits. An elected council of elders, the Gerousia, guided them, and decisions were often made through a citizen assembly, the appella. But these bodies were small. Only full Spartans could participate, and those Spartans were few. So how did such a small group maintain control over an entire region? The answer was pressure. Constant, low-burning, invisible pressure. And the crypteia was one of the most precise instruments in that system. It served no official judicial function. It was not a court or a police force. But it reinforced the most important rule in Sparta. Helots must never believe they can rise. Let's return to those nights on the outskirts of helot villages. Picture this. It's autumn. The fields are quiet, harvested. A helot family sits around a small fire, sharing what food they've managed to keep after delivering their portion to the state. There's laughter. A story is told. Perhaps a son asks, "Why must we always give so much?" And then there's a noise outside. A flicker. A shadow. They freeze. Because in Sparta, the crypteia is always watching, always listening. And the line between a bold question and a death sentence is thin. This was no fantasy. The crypteia wasn't everywhere at once, but that was never the point. What mattered was the belief that it could be. That belief controlled the helots more effectively than any wall or guard. The fear was generational. Helot parents taught their children not to speak too loudly, not to show too much spirit, not to organize or gather or challenge anything, even in whispers, because somewhere beyond the olive trees, a boy in a dark cloak might be waiting, and so the crypteia served two masters. To the helots, it was terror. To the young Spartans, it was transformation. For the boys selected to serve, the crypteia was a kind of final trial, the quiet end to the long ordeal of the agoge. And unlike training, which occurred in groups, the crypteia was solitary. You had to survive alone, decide alone, kill alone. No instructor to guide you, no brother to watch your back, just you, your instincts, and the state's expectations. This shaped a very specific kind of man. Spartans prized not only strength, but calculation. Obedience not just in action, but in thought. To be able to kill without question, in silence, and then return to the mess hall as though nothing had happened, that was control, and it produced, generation after generation, a citizen class that was both feared and deeply constrained. Because to internalize this level of obedience, to suppress even your emotions, is to become something beyond ordinary, or perhaps something less. The crypteia also served a social function. It elevated those who succeeded. Young men who performed well in the crypteia often rose quickly in the Spartan hierarchy. They were viewed as elite, not just for their courage, but for their ability to be invisible, obedient, effective. Some historians believe the cryptia acted as a kind of precursor to Sparta's officer corps, those who would lead the phalanx, formations, coordinate campaigns, and guide younger soldiers. But not everyone admired it. Even in the ancient world, the crypteia was controversial. Plato mentions it briefly in Laws, but not with praise. Aristotle writes about it with unease. And later, Plutarch, writing in the Roman period, describes it in more lurid detail, possibly amplifying its horrors for effect. This ambiguity is part of the crypteia's strange legacy. It is simultaneously a real practice and a whispered myth, a tool of control and a rite of power. Some scholars even debate whether it existed exactly as described or if it was exaggerated by outsiders who could not comprehend Spartan methods, but whether fully, and yet systems can only be sustained so long. Over time, the Helots began to push back. There were rebellions. The most famous followed the earthquake of 464 BCE, which killed thousands of Spartans. The Helots saw an opening, and they rose. It took years to crush the revolt. The Spartans, for all their discipline, struggled. Their tiny citizen population was not built for drawn-out internal conflict. They needed help. They even called on Athens, a rival, for support. This was a turning point. It showed that the Helots could fight, that the crypteia and other control mechanisms weren't invincible. It also showed the limits of Spartan pride. And from then on, Sparta became more cautious, more rigid, less willing to innovate. Some historians believe that the crypteia became less active in later centuries. Perhaps it faded with the decline of the agoge, or perhaps it simply became less necessary as Sparta's military strength diminished and its enemies grew bolder. Eventually, even the Helots were freed, at least in name. After the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BCE, Sparta's power was broken. Messenia was liberated, and the people who had lived under Spartan control for centuries were finally allowed to live and speak without shadows. What happened to the crypteia then? It likely dissolved, not with a grand speech or a law, but with silence, the same silence that had once made it powerful. The boys were no longer sent into the night. The Helots no longer trembled at rustling leaves, and Sparta, once a city, defined by what it feared, was left to face a new kind of darkness, irrelevance. In the final section of this story, we'll reflect on the legacy of the crypteia, what it teaches us about control, fear, and the cost of obedience that asks for silence instead of thought. The crypteia was never meant to last forever. It wasn't carved in marble or immortalized in oaths. It left behind no battle cries, no statues, no songs. It was built on absence, on whispers, on the invisible, on the power of things that were not said out loud. But in that silence, it shaped Sparta, and perhaps more importantly, it shaped the way we remember Sparta. By the time Roman authors visited the ruins of Sparta, the crypteia was no longer active. But its legend had already taken on a life of its own. The idea of teenage boys sent into the night with daggers, not to fight enemies, but to suppress their own population, was shocking. Even centuries later, it felt brutal, even for the ancient world. Roman admiration for Spartan discipline often came with a grimace when discussing the crypteia. It was the part of the Spartan system that could not be easily romanticized. There were no beautiful speeches, no noble sacrifices, just quiet killing, sanctioned by law. So what does that say about Sparta? It says that discipline, when taken to extremes, can hollow a society from within. That fear, even carefully administered, even ritualized, doesn't disappear when the weapons are put away. It lingers. It shapes the soul. The crypteia was not just a military tool, it was a psychological one. For the Helots, it was a constant threat. For the Spartan youths, it was a method of control disguised as promotion. It taught them not just to obey, but to believe that silence was strength, and that questioning was weakness. And over time, that lesson took its toll. Because if every citizen is trained to obey without question, who will adapt when the world changes? Who will innovate when war is no longer the measure of success? Who will speak when speaking might mean exile or worse? As the Spartan military declined and other city-states advanced in trade, technology, and diplomacy, Sparta clung to its silence. Its systems became symbols, its rituals became relics, and the crypteia, once a tool of terror, became a story, a dark story, a story told in lowered voices, and yet it continues to fascinate. Historians still debate its details. Was it truly an organized institution? Was it annual? Did it include mass killings or just surveillance? Were there limits? Did some crypteia members refuse? We may never know. The records are fragmented, the evidence indirect, and perhaps that's fitting. Because the crypteia was never about clarity. It was about uncertainty, the kind of quiet that keeps you from sleeping too soundly. But even shadows leave outlines, in the structure of the agoge, in the silence of the mess halls, in the lack of rebellion for so many centuries. The crypteia may have been unofficial, but its effects were written all over Spartan life. It also shaped the kind of citizen Sparta valued, not just strong, but silent, not just obedient, but invisible when required. Someone who could blend into the landscape, strike with precision, and then return to the mess table as if nothing had happened. That kind of citizen is effective in battle, but less so in peace. When the world shifted toward diplomacy, economy, and alliances, Sparta had no answer. Its tools, like the crypteia, were designed for control, not connection. And so the society that once trained boys to kill with silence eventually faded with silence of its own. The last known references to anything resembling the crypteia date to the Hellenistic period, when Sparta was more myth than power. Later accounts may have exaggerated its horrors or misunderstood its rules, but they never exaggerated its impact. It left a moral question that still resonates. What is the cost of control? How much should a society sacrifice in the name of security? And what happens to those who carry out its orders, alone, unseen, and unacknowledged? The crypteia trained boys to disappear, and in time they did, along with the system that created them. But perhaps that's what makes the story so quietly haunting. It wasn't the death toll, it wasn't the brutality, it was the quiet, the way fear was passed down like a family recipe, the way silence became law, the way shadows were made to serve the state, and the way a boy, still growing, still unsure, was handed a dagger and told, "Go." No glory, no ceremony, just a mission that could not be explained, and a city that would never ask what he saw in the dark. Imagine a city where having too much furniture was considered suspicious, where coins made of gold were outlawed, where travel for pleasure was frowned upon, and where even eating too well could damage your reputation. That city was Sparta. In the ancient Greek world, wealth was usually worn openly. In Athens, for example, a wealthy man might host grand symposiums, build statues, or commission plays. In Corinth, rich families showed their status with lavish houses and finely dressed wives. But in Sparta, status wasn't about what you displayed. It was about what you hid, and in some cases, what you refused. Sparta's approach to wealth was not just minimalist. It was institutionally austere. Riches were seen as corrosive. Comfort was weakness, possessions, distractions. These weren't simply personal values, they were public policy. Much of this ethos is attributed to the semi-legendary figure of Lycurgus, the lawgiver of Sparta. Whether Lycurgus was real, or a composite of early leaders, or even entirely mythical is unclear. But the system credited to him shaped Sparta for centuries. One of the most radical aspects of that system was its economic design. Lycurgus, we are told, sought to eliminate greed, inequality, and corruption by removing the root cause, money. He introduced an unusual currency, iron bars, heavy and impractical, called pellinors. These were so large and so low in value that storing or stealing them was pointless. They were essentially unspendable outside of Sparta. Gold and silver coinage was banned altogether. Merchants who brought luxury goods found no buyers. Travelers, who expected fine gifts, left empty-handed. In doing this, Sparta created an insulated economy, one that discouraged trade, luxury, and personal accumulation. And it worked, for a while. Men were judged not by their wealth, but by their courage. Success was measured not in silver, but in scars. And while some Spartans were indeed rich, owning land, helots, and resources, they were expected to live modestly. Ostentation was shameful. Displaying wealth could get you mocked, excluded, or worse, dishonored. This suspicion of wealth extended into other areas of life. Spartans were discouraged from traveling abroad. Why? Because foreign cities were seen as dangerous, not because of armies, but because of ideas. Athens was full of rhetoric, art, debate, and ambition. Corinth glittered with trade and artisanship. Sparta feared contamination. Foreigners were also discouraged from staying too long in Sparta. The system was protective, almost paranoid. Outsiders brought new ideas, new luxuries, and new expectations. They upset the fragile equilibrium of Spartan sameness. Even food was regulated by social norms. As discussed in earlier stories, Spartan men ate their main meal in Syssitia, the military mess halls. The food was intentionally bland, with black broth at the center. Overindulgence in food, drink, or appearance was considered dishonorable. Clothing was plain, hairstyles uniform, and furniture? Spartan homes were sparse. Simplicity wasn't a trend, it was policy. Even the way they walked, spoke, and joked was shaped by this austere code. Women too were expected to embody restraint. Though they controlled land and managed estates, their appearance and demeanor were guided by Spartan values. They were praised for strength, not softness, for presence, not ornament. But did this system eliminate inequality? Not exactly. While gold and silver were banned, land was not redistributed equally. Some families inherited vast estates, others had less. Over time, this led to a quiet but growing imbalance. Since wealth could no longer be flaunted, it became more hidden, and thus harder to challenge. Still, for many years, the system held. Spartans lived simply. Their city had no grand temples, no luxury markets, no ostentatious festivals. Visitors from other cities found it strange, even primitive, but the Spartans saw themselves as superior. Their strength, they believed, came from their discipline, their ability to defeat luxury, their refusal to bend. Yet even a society built on self-denial is not immune to change. Trade routes expanded, new alliances formed, war brought plunder, and even the strictest citizens began to feel the tug of gold. In the next section, we'll explore how cracks began to form in Sparta's economic armor, and how the city tried and failed to resist the creeping influence of comfort, currency, and change. Sparta, for much of its history, was a city that prided itself on resistance, not just to enemies, but to temptation. Temptation in the form of foreign ideas, decorative furniture, soft fabrics, leisure, and especially money. And yet, as with all rigid systems, the very act of resisting change created fractures too fine to see until they widened into rifts. Let's begin with the issue of land. Sparta may have outlawed gold and silver currency, but it did not outlaw inheritance. Land was passed from one generation to the next, and over time it began to concentrate in the hands of fewer and fewer families. You see, Spartan law was not built to handle economic nuance. It had been designed to create uniformity, not equity. Men were supposed to be equals, homoioi, united by shared training, shared meals, and shared purpose. But as land slipped out of circulation, some Spartans quietly became far wealthier than others. They just couldn't show it publicly, and so wealth became private, quiet, hidden behind plain cloaks and modest mess hall meals. A man might own vast olive groves and dozens of helot laborers, but still sit on a rough bench eating barley porridge like everyone else. This was perhaps the beginning of the end, because once inequality exists, and once it becomes invisible, it becomes even harder to address. The state, still clinging to its founding ideals, made no provisions for redistribution. No taxes on the wealthy, no public building programs to balance things out. Instead, it simply looked the other way, while pretending that all Spartans were still equals. Meanwhile, outside Sparta's borders, the world was changing. Athens had built an empire on trade, theatre, architecture, and foreign influence. Corinth was rich with craftsmanship and commerce. Even small polis were experimenting with new governance structures, new alliances, and yes, new luxuries. And Sparta, still refusing to allow its citizens to travel freely abroad. This travel restriction, meant to preserve Spartan purity, instead began to isolate Sparta intellectually. Its citizens were increasingly unaware of innovations in tactics, technology, or diplomacy. They were trained to fight, but not to adapt. Ironically, foreigners were still allowed into Sparta on occasion: diplomats, observers, and the occasional philosopher. What they saw was a city of contradictions. They saw wealth but not luxury, discipline but not reform, strength but not growth. Even the famed Spartan ban on currency began to erode, quietly, slowly, under pressure. In times of war, gold had its uses: bribing allies, paying for mercenaries, purchasing grain during famine. Sparta, while officially anti-coinage, began to use money unofficially when it served their needs. Kings, in particular, were allowed more latitude, and in campaigns outside the Peloponnese, they often accepted and used foreign currency. The contradiction widened further after the Peloponnesian War, when Sparta, having defeated Athens, found itself with spoils of war, new territory, and new administrative burdens. For a city built on the rejection of wealth, victory brought an awkward problem: what to do with it? Some Spartans resisted. They argued that to accept spoils was to invite softness. That gold in the treasury meant rot in the soul. Others, particularly among the leadership, found reasons to bend. This bending was never officially declared. There was no reform of the gold ban. But in practice, the prohibition on currency weakened. Wealthier families stored valuables quietly. Trade increased. New relationships with other Greek cities, and eventually foreign empires, brought more resources in and out of Sparta. And though the old iron bars, pelennors, still existed, they were increasingly symbolic and like the black broth in the mess halls. More ritual than reality. Even Spartan clothing, once rigidly plain, began to show signs of change. Slight flourishes, dyes, embroidered trims, nothing flamboyant, at first. But it marked a shift. Spartan youth, too, became harder to control. The agoge still existed, but participation declined. Discipline waned, and some wealthier families found ways to keep their sons from enduring the full rigor of the training. Comfort, it turns out, is contagious. Once introduced, it doesn't need to shout. It just waits, and in Sparta it waited patiently, in hidden rooms under folded cloaks behind tightly closed doors. One attempt to correct this came in the form of King Agis IV, who ruled in the 3rd century BCE. He tried to reinstate the old laws of Lycurgus, land redistribution, debt cancellation, the restoration of the agoge and the syssitia. His goal was to bring back the true Sparta, to reverse the creeping influence of inequality and luxury. But it was too late. The wealthy resisted. The balance of power had shifted. Agis was eventually executed, his reforms reversed, his supporters silenced. Another king, Cleomenes III, tried again. More forcefully, he seized property, redistributed land, cancelled debts, and tried to rebuild the citizen body. For a time it worked. But once again, outside forces, including the Macedonians, crushed the effort. Sparta had waited too long to fix itself, and so by the Roman period, the city became more symbol than state. Foreigners visited to see the old ways performed. Boys were still whipped at Artemis Orthia, men still ate black broth. But it was theatre now, not policy. The war against gold had been lost, not with a battle, but with a shrug, and perhaps the saddest part. Sparta still told itself it was the same, that it had not changed, that the values of Lycurgus still held, but the iron currency lay rusted in forgotten corners. The cloaks were still red, but the pockets were lined, and the ban on comfort, once so proudly enforced, had become little more than a memory. In the next section, we'll explore the final unraveling of Spartan austerity and how the desire to preserve a myth eventually led to the collapse of the system that gave it meaning. By the time Sparta entered its final centuries of independence, the once proud city of warriors, black broth, and iron bars had become a city of illusions. The values remained, but the people no longer did. Sparta still banned gold officially, still discouraged travel officially, still mocked luxury officially. But the system that enforced those bans had withered, replaced not by revolution, but by neglect. This is what happens when an ideal is maintained in law but abandoned in practice. The outer shell stays standing, even as the structure inside crumbles. Let's return to the streets of later Sparta, perhaps around the 2nd century BCE. A visitor from Rome arrives, curious about the strange Dorian city that once dominated all of Greece. He expects to see hard men walking in formation, plain cloaks, no ornament, simple homes. He expects silence, discipline, austerity, and he sees some of it. Boys still train in the agoge, or at least a version of it. They still run barefoot, shout commands, chant hymns. Men still gather in mess halls, still eat together, still dip bread into black broth, though the recipes are more varied now. Still sleep on hard beds, at least when others are watching. But ask any servant or glance behind a private curtain, and the truth becomes harder to hide. The richest families now host dinners in private. The finest wines come from abroad. Land. Ownership is deeply unequal. Some citizens still the ban on gold coinage, circumvented. Wealthier Spartans now trade through intermediaries or simply keep foreign currency hidden. Silver rings, fine cups, imported linens, all present, just not loudly. Travel restrictions, technically still in place. But wealthier Spartans send their sons to study in Athens or even Alexandria. Philosophers from other cities are invited for conversation. The outside world has arrived, not with armies, but with books, coins, and curiosity. And comfort now lives in corners. The chairs are a bit softer, the fires burn longer, the homes are a bit warmer in winter, and the sandals a bit more finely stitched. It is not overt. Sparta has never been ostentatious, but it is there. Quietly, steadily, comfort has replaced rigor. Not by force, but by forgetting. The city once built to train soldiers now hosts tourists. The festivals, once rituals of endurance, are now performances. Roman writers marvel at the old ways of Sparta. They write essays about its simplicity. They praise the Spartan ban on wealth, even as they toss coins to helots carrying their bags. There is something tragic in this. Sparta's war against gold, travel, and comfort was not lost in battle. It was lost in the creeping reality of time. A city that had refused to evolve discovered, too late, that rigidity is not the same as resilience. This didn't happen overnight. There were still Spartans who believed, who lived simply, who spoke in laconic tones and refused wine at banquets. But they were fewer now, and their example was harder to follow in a city that no longer punished indulgence the way it once did. Even the Syssitia, the communal mess halls, began to decline. Some mess groups couldn't meet their food quotas. The cost of maintaining the meals rose as land became concentrated and citizens declined. Younger Spartans raised in wealthier households began to resent the tradition. Some paid others to fulfill their duties. Others simply skipped the meals, relying on loopholes and favors. The agoge too began to soften. By the Roman period it had become less about survival and more about ceremony. Boys still trained, but with less brutality. Whippings became ritualized. Endurance became dramatized. The harshness was still there, but it was no longer formative. It was a costume. And so Sparta, which had once outlawed comfort, now became a curiosity for those who could afford it. Roman emperors visited. Senators brought their sons to see the true Spartans. Observers watched the boys being flogged at Artemis Orthia and admired the blood. They applauded the silence, then returned to their villas. The paradox was complete. Sparta, which had banned gold, now depended on foreign gold for tourism. Which had banned travel, now welcomed guests. Which had mocked comfort, now sold it, slowly, subtly, and with a straight face. In truth, no society can live indefinitely by outlawing pleasure. Discomfort is a tool, not a purpose. Simplicity, when enforced without empathy, becomes brittle. Sparta had built its greatness on resilience, but it had mistaken that resilience for permanence, and when change finally came, in the form of shifting economies, new empires, new technologies, Sparta was not ready. What it had banned could not be ignored forever, and once those bans were no longer enforced, what remained was a city that didn't quite know who it was anymore. Was it still the home of Lycurgus, or just a museum? Was its silence still discipline, or merely emptiness? These are the questions we are left with when we walk through the ruins of Sparta today. No towering temples, no great libraries, just stones and stories. Stories of a city that tried to outlaw wealth, luxury, and change, and a reminder that even the hardest walls, if built too high, can keep out the very things a society needs to survive. If you want to understand the power of ancient Sparta, you have to look not at its warriors but at its workers, not at the shield wall, but at the plow. Because while the Spartans marched, trained, and fought, someone else was growing their food, tending their animals, weaving their garments, and carrying their burdens. That someone was the Helots. Rarely mentioned in detail by ancient historians and often overshadowed by the armor and spears of Spartan myth, the Helots were the enslaved class who made the entire Spartan system possible, and they were more than just background figures. They were the essential machinery of Spartan daily life, and its greatest long-term threat. Let's begin with who they were. The Helots were not imported slaves, like in other Greek cities. They were native peoples, mostly from Messenia, a region west of Laconia that had been conquered by Sparta in the 8th and 7th centuries BCE. After bitter wars, the Messenians were subjugated and transformed into state-owned serfs. They were not bought or sold in markets. They belonged to the land, and by extension to the Spartan state. But make no mistake, this was not freedom. Helots had no legal rights, no political representation, and no security. They worked farms assigned to Spartan citizens, gave up a large portion of their crops, often half, and lived under constant surveillance. They were the reason Spartan men didn't have to farm, why they could spend their youth in the agoge, why they could train every day, dine in mess halls, and march off to war without worrying about their vineyards back home. But the numbers, that was the real issue. In most estimates, Helots outnumbered Spartans by at least 7-1 and in some cases more. Imagine a system where every citizen is supported by multiple forced laborers, and those laborers live beside you, serve you, and deeply resent you. Sparta knew this, and it shaped everything. The crypteia, which we explored in Story 4, was one tool of control, a silent, deadly reminder to the Helots that they were never safe. But beyond that, the entire structure of Spartan society was built around the fear of rebellion. Spartan men trained not just for foreign war, but for internal suppression. Rebellions were expected, not just feared. And when they came, they were brutal. One of the most significant Helot uprisings happened after the devastating earthquake of 464 BCE, which killed thousands of Spartans. The Helots seized the moment, fortified themselves in the hills of Ithome, and resisted for years. Sparta was so threatened by this rebellion that it called for help from Athens, a deeply ironic move, considering the fierce rivalry between the two cities. And though Athens initially agreed, Sparta later sent the Athenian forces home, reportedly fearing they would sympathize with the Helots or get too curious about Sparta's internal weaknesses. The rebellion was eventually crushed, but it left a scar, and it proved something. The Helots were not broken. They were watching, waiting, enduring. Day to day, the life of a Helot was grueling. They farmed, they raised livestock, they delivered produce, they served in households, they followed orders. And while some were allowed to live in family units and raise children, they could be punished or killed with little provocation. There are stories of Helots being forced to get drunk in front of Spartan youths as a warning against the dangers of excess. Others were made to wear humiliating costumes or perform degrading tasks, and yet they endured because there was no other option. Escape was nearly impossible. Other city-states would not welcome them, and within Sparta, resistance meant death. But despite this, Helots maintained some aspects of culture. They had songs, dances, and rituals. They worshipped gods. They passed down stories. Though most are lost to time, they lived full human lives under the weight of a system designed to erase their significance. And while they were not soldiers, Helots sometimes fought alongside Spartans, especially in times of desperation. Some were given limited arms, some even promised freedom in exchange for service. But these promises were rarely kept. Occasionally, Helots were freed and became a separate class known as Neodamodeus. But this was rare and often temporary. The line between freed Helot and Helot again was thin and easily crossed by politics. So what does this tell us? That the Spartan miracle, the ability to train boys into soldiers, to conquer their neighbors, to hold the line at Thermopylae, was not a miracle at all. It was a system, and the system had gears. The Helots were those gears. Ground down, silenced and often invisible, but essential. Without them, there was no Sparta. In the next section, we'll explore what life may have felt like for a Helot, not just physically, but psychologically. What did it mean to raise children in a world where your labor built someone else's freedom, where the law was a wall you could never climb? To understand the full weight of Helot life in Sparta, we have to step away from the records of kings and soldiers and imagine something more ordinary. A pair of worn hands, calloused from years of grain harvesting. A child hiding behind a stone, wall quiet at the sight of red cloaks passing by. A woman measuring out grain not to feed her family, but to meet a quota. A man waking before sunrise not to train for glory, but to sow someone else's land. This was Sparta too. For every young Spartan boy learning to endure pain in the agoge, There were 3 or 4 helot children already doing the same, but without the promise of citizenship or honor. A helot's day started early. Most were assigned to plots of land, kleroi, owned by a Spartan citizen. These plots were not small gardens, but full farms, producing olives, barley, grapes, and wheat. The helots did the ploughing, the weeding, the harvesting. They tended livestock. They pressed olives and fermented wine, and then handed over much of the yield to their assigned Spartan master. In theory, helots were allowed to keep what remained. In practice, that depended on the Spartan. Some may have allowed enough for survival, others less so. It was a life built on careful navigation. Helots had no weapons, no rights. They lived always under the possibility of punishment, and the punishments were often public. Helots could be beaten, not necessarily for wrongdoing, but simply to remind them of their place. They were required to wear specific clothing, often rough and deliberately humiliating. They were forbidden from participating in Spartan civic life, festivals, or courts, and yet they raised children. What did helot parents teach their children? To stay quiet? To keep their heads down? To never speak out of turn? Likely all of this and more. They taught them to endure, to obey, but also quietly to hope, because even under oppression, people dream. Some helots fled, some likely rebelled, in small ways, meant by hiding grain, by working more slowly, by telling forbidden stories. Others cooperated, not out of loyalty but out of survival. And still their role was indispensable. The Spartans, for all their power, could not sustain themselves. They were trained to fight, not to farm. Their entire civic and military lifestyle rested on the assumption that someone else, invisible, silent, and subjugated, would grow their food. The helots were not a flaw in the Spartan system. They were the system. But that system required constant maintenance. Not in the form of repair, but repression. And so the fear of rebellion hovered over Sparta like smoke. The annual declaration of war on the helots, allowing crypteia members to kill without religious consequence, wasn't about strategy. It was about control. About making sure the helots never forgot they were being watched. The most infamous example of this was the massacre of 2,000 helots sometime in the 5th century BCE. According to Thucydides, the Spartans invited the most promising helots, those who had shown exceptional loyalty or bravery, to a supposed celebration. They were wined, dined, and praised, and then they were taken away and quietly executed. No trial, no public accusation, just elimination. Why? Because they were dangerous. Not because they had rebelled, but because they might lead others to rebel. This is perhaps the clearest insight into how Sparta saw its enslaved class, not just as laborers, but as a constant threat, a quiet army waiting for a spark. And yet, over centuries, the helots persisted. They found ways to keep their communities alive. They passed down language, song, and story. They married, raised children, and watched generations of Spartans come and go. They saw kings rise and fall, wars begin and end. They endured earthquakes, rebellions, plagues, and poverty, and all. The while they sowed the fields. Some helots were able to buy or earn their freedom. These neo-demodes were given a new class standing, not citizens, but no longer enslaved. They served in armies, sometimes with distinction, but they never became full Spartans. The doors of the Apella, the citizen assembly, remained closed to them. There were also mothakes, non-citizens, sometimes sons of helots, who were raised alongside Spartans in the agoge. A few of these individuals rose to positions of influence, even military leadership. But they were exceptions. The rule was clear. You could serve Sparta. You could feed it. You could even die for it. But you could never belong to it. And that's what makes the story of the helots so essential to understanding Sparta, not as a city of strength, but as a city of control. Every Spartan victory was built on helot labor. Every Spartan feast was seasoned with helot sweat. Every Spartan ritual, from the secession to the crypteia, existed in part to remind the helots of what they were not. And yet, Sparta could never erase them. In the next section, we'll explore how the helot question eventually helped bring down the entire Spartan system, and what happened to these people when the city of red cloaks finally lost its grip. For centuries, the Helots remained in the shadows of Spartan society, tilling the soil, bearing the burden, feeding the very people who feared them. But even the most tightly controlled systems eventually crack. Not because the oppressed rise all at once, but because the pressure becomes impossible to contain. And in Sparta, the pressure was always building. By the end of the 5th century BCE, the cracks had begun to show. The great earthquake of 464 BCE had already rattled more than buildings. It had shaken the very premise of Spartan security, that a small warrior elite could keep a vastly larger population under control through silence, fear, and force. The Helot rebellion that followed was long, brutal, and deeply humiliating for Sparta. It wasn't an isolated riot. It was a military campaign, requiring years of siege warfare and support from reluctant allies. And it was a warning. The Helots were watching. They weren't just laborers. They were a population in waiting, waiting for the Spartan citizen, body to grow weak, distracted, or divided. And that moment did come. As Sparta's wars with Athens dragged on through the long and exhausting Peloponnesian War, Spartan casualties mounted. The number of full citizens, homoioi, declined rapidly. Each death on the battlefield didn't just cost a life, it chipped away at the already fragile elite who held political power, owned land, and controlled the Helots. To bolster their ranks, the Spartans began doing something unthinkable in earlier centuries. They started arming Helots. At first it was rare, temporary, only for desperate battles. But over time, the line between citizen and non-citizen blurred, not by ideology, but by necessity. The Neodamodeus, freed Helots who had fought for Sparta, became more common. They lived as quasi-citizens, never given voting rights or full social status, but increasingly vital to Sparta's survival. These men had proven themselves in combat. They had bled for a city that still saw them as second class. This created a deep contradiction. How could a society demand loyalty from the very people it refused to acknowledge as equals? How long could Helots, or their sons, be expected to carry the shield without receiving a seat at the table? Sparta never answered this question. Instead, it clung tighter to tradition, and that tradition demanded fewer citizens, stricter rules, and an unchanging hierarchy, even as the world outside Sparta evolved rapidly. By the 4th century BCE, the city had fewer than 1,000 full citizens. Some estimates place it closer to 700. For a military state, this was catastrophic. There simply weren't enough Spartans to control the Helots, lead campaigns, or maintain the rituals of daily life. Meanwhile, other Greek cities, and later Macedonian and Roman powers, expanded. Their systems adapted. Their definitions of citizenship broadened. Sparta remained still, and stillness in time became weakness. Eventually, Epaminondas of Thebes delivered the final blow. After the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BCE, Sparta's dominance ended. The myth of invincibility, carefully nurtured for centuries, was shattered, and with it the Helots saw their moment. Epaminondas marched into Messenia, the Helots' ancestral homeland, and liberated it. He established an independent Messenian state, giving the Helots land protection and autonomy. For the first time in over 300 years, the Helots were free. And Sparta. Sparta never recovered. Without the Helots, it could no longer support its citizen army. The entire social and military framework collapsed. The agoge continued, but hollowed. The Syssitia continued, but with fewer members. The Crypteia ended, because its targets were gone. The Helots had not risen in a single night of revolt. They had waited, endured, watched. And when the time came, they stepped away, not with revenge, but with relief. And what of their legacy? It's difficult to say. Unlike the Spartans, the Helots left few inscriptions, no epic poems, no histories. Their voices are absent from the written record, erased not by accident, but by design. What we know of them comes mostly from the people who controlled them. But in that silence is a truth more powerful than any battle. The real strength of Sparta, the warriors, the rituals, the rigid order, was made possible by people it refused to acknowledge. People who lived without thanks. So the next time you hear the story of the 300 Spartans at Thermopylae, remember that for each of those warriors, there were many more helots, back in the fields, unseen, unheard, and perhaps they too were brave, not in battle, but in enduring every day in a city that was built on their backs. In the ancient world, walls were more than stone. They were symbols. Walls told you who a city feared, who it excluded, how much it trusted the world beyond its gates. Athens had walls, massive ones. Corinth had walls. Thebes, Syracuse, even small polis ringed themselves with fortifications, not just to protect against invasion, but to declare, "We are here and we are prepared." But Sparta had no walls. At Aurea, at least not for a long time, and not the kind you'd expect. The decision wasn't because of a shortage of stone or engineering knowledge or even money. It was a deliberate choice, a policy, a principle. According to tradition, the lawgiver Lycurgus, whose semi-mythical presence continues to shape every story about Sparta, declared that Sparta needed no walls. Its strength was its people. Its walls were the iron hearts and disciplined bodies of its citizens. If enemies came, they would face a wall of bronze shields, not bricks. It was a beautiful idea, a powerful idea, and a deeply risky one. Because, while ideals may inspire, they don't always stop armies. Still, Sparta stuck to it. For centuries, the city remained unfortified, even as it grew into one of the most feared military powers in the Greek world. It trained its citizens from youth to stand firm in battle, to never retreat, and to embody the strength that other cities tried to build with mortar. But this Spartan exceptionalism came at a cost. The lack of walls shaped the city's geography in unusual ways. Unlike the dense urban sprawl of Athens, Sparta was a loose collection of villages, spread out across the Eurotas Valley. There was no central acropolis crowned with marble, no walled market bustling with drama and oratory. Just farmland, scattered homes, and the occasional temple, all lightly guarded. This layout made the city hard to attack, but also hard to defend. If an enemy breached the valley, there was little to stop them from moving freely. And yet, for a long time it didn't matter, because Sparta projected fear. Its soldiers were famous, its discipline legendary. Even Persian kings treaded carefully around Spartan pride. Many invaders simply didn't bother. Sparta had become a wall unto itself, but over time, as the world changed, that confidence began to falter. Let's take a closer look at why Sparta resisted walls for so long, and what finally changed. First, the philosophy. The Spartans believed that walls made cities soft, that once people had stone barriers to hide behind, they stopped cultivating courage. They stayed home, they grew fearful. A citizen who believed a wall would save him was, to Sparta's way of thinking, already halfway conquered. There's an old Spartan saying, often attributed to one of the kings, "A city is well fortified when it has a wall of men instead of brick." This wasn't just rhetoric, it shaped policy. Foreign ambassadors were sometimes astonished to see how open the Spartan capital was. No massive gates, no fortified towers, just fields, roads, men in red cloaks training in the sun. It must have seemed either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish. But to the Spartans, it was logical. They had built a society of warriors, and warriors, they believed, should not need to hide behind walls. There was another reason too, the helots. As we've seen in previous stories, Sparta relied heavily on this enslaved population to feed itself, and the helots lived outside the main city, in rural communities often near the Messenian border. If Sparta had walled itself in, it would have cut itself off from its own agricultural base. More importantly, it would have signaled fear, not of foreign enemies but of the helots. So instead, the Spartans chose openness, not generosity but visibility. Helots could see the city, work near it, be near their masters, and be reminded constantly of their own place. But the open city came with risks. In 371 BCE, Sparta's confidence finally shattered. At the Battle of Leuctra, the Theban general Epaminondas used new tactics, deep phalanxes, concentrated attacks, to crush the Spartan army. It was a devastating loss. For the first time in living memory, Sparta was not just defeated, it was vulnerable. And in the years that followed, the unthinkable happened. Thebes invaded Laconia. They marched into Spartan territory. They freed the Helots of Messenia. They founded new cities on formerly Spartan land, and they did so without encountering a single wall. Sparta, for all its pride and principle, had left itself exposed. The psychological blow was immense. The myth of Spartan invincibility, built over generations, collapsed in a few short years, and still Sparta did not immediately build walls.